We can get going. So welcome everybody. My name is Daniel Cook. I'm with Alba. Welcome to our latest webinar. And in this one, we're going to discuss duty drawback. So we've been very fortunate in being able to bring in some real experts from the industry on duty drawback, and I want to introduce them to you now. So on our panel today, we have Raphael Schlosser, CEO, and John Christopher, the head of duty drawback from DutyWise, an organization focused on the duty drawback process. Back with me again this time is our very own Adam Lees, our Vice President of Customs Brokerage. Adam's often a panelist at brokerage events, and if you've been reading our tariff FAQs, then Adam is the mastermind behind them. So welcome back, Adam.
Thank you, Daniel. Welcome, everyone. So over the past 10 days, we have witnessed some significant developments in the realm of international trade. For the Section 301 exclusions initially set to expire on May 30th, these exclusions have been extended through August 31st, providing some substantial financial relief to importers. The IEEPA tariffs. These tariffs imposed on goods from Canada, Mexico, China, Hong Kong, and Macau due to the fentanyl epidemic, along with those reciprocal tariffs, were deemed illegal by the Court of International Trade. However, they've been reinstated pending the decision of the appeals court. Steel and aluminum tariffs. As of yesterday, tariffs on steel and aluminum have increased to 50% from 25% for all countries except the UK. Additionally, non-metal content for steel and aluminum derivatives no longer are exempt from reciprocal tariffs. And then there's the in-transit provision extension. The exclusion from reciprocal tariffs has been extended from May 27th through June 16th. So, as Jack Welch, one of the great business leaders of the 20th century, once said, when there's change, there's opportunity. And with that in mind, I'm pleased to introduce Raphael and John, as Daniel mentioned, from DutyWise, esteemed partners of Alba, who are here to discuss some of these opportunities for importers to recoup some of these trade remedies and many more opportunities to recoup some dollars. So with that, gentlemen, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Adam. I'm excited to be here and share a little bit about Drawback. So let's quickly cover what we're going to talk about. Some of you may have heard about Drawback, and it instills two different kinds of feelings. Either excitement, it's free money, or maybe you're a little scared. You've been told it's complicated, it's risky, it's not for you. And so hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have a clear picture of whether or not you or your company is eligible for Drawback and overall what's involved in the process. So we'll start with a brief overview of Drawback by the numbers and give a sense of the size and scale of the program and why now. John will take us through a bit of a background on Drawback and some high-level concepts within, and then we'll dive into topics that will hopefully bring it home for you, help you understand whether or not you're eligible, some common challenges, and a high-level view of the process and the timeline, which is, I'm sure, something we're all wondering about. As Daniel and Adam said, feel free to drop questions in, and we'll try and weave those through as we go, and if not, we'll try and cover them at the end. So, very quickly, Drawback by the numbers. So, as you can see from the chart, Drawback is not a static program. Now, this is all pre the latest round of tariffs, but over the last couple of years, and really since 2018, when Section 301 came into being, Drawback has been a program that has grown significantly year over year. You can imagine this year that chart is going to continue going up and to the right. And that's, for a number of reasons. Awareness is increasing, technology is making it more accessible. And as we all know, tariffs are increasing. The opportunity is getting larger. Now, the thing that most people don't know is that 70% of Drawback is left unclaimed each year. So if last year we had $4.6 billion in Drawback claims filed, there's another humongous opportunity out there. And my guess is that many of you in the room fall into that bucket. There's obviously a number of reasons why Drawback has been such a high percentage unclaimed. It's not just press a button and get it done. It can be complicated, but we'll walk through those and help you understand what the challenges are and how to approach them. Another fact about Drawback that sort of gets people really excited is, you can go back 5 years from the date of import. That is a long time. I can barely remember what I had for breakfast this morning, but you can go back 5 years. So, it's never too late. There are some things to be aware of that we'll walk through, but 5 years is an important number to remember, and generally applies to most parts of Drawback. And then lastly is 4 weeks. That's a number that's good to know. If you go through the process for application privileges, which we'll talk about as well, you can get your refund back as fast as 3 to 4 weeks after you file your claims. So with that, I'll turn it over to John, who will help us walk us through what is Drawback.
Absolutely. Thanks, Raf. And first, I want to thank you, our friends at Alba. Thanks for inviting us to speak at this webinar. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I know it's a crazy busy time, and I hope you make your time worth it, right? My personal hope is that by the end of the session, you walk away not intimidated by Drawback. There's a lot of talk about Drawback out there, and as Raf said, people think it's complicated, but it's really not, right? The concepts are very clear, and we'll try to make it clear for you. I want you to walk away with a clear, confident understanding of what duty drawback truly is and how it can benefit your companies. So I'm going to start with a very, very, very brief history lesson on Drawback for you folks that may want historical context on what it is. So Drawback is America's oldest trade incentive program. It's been part of U.S. trade law since the Tariff Act of 1789. I'm just going to let that sit for a little bit. 1789, that's the same year that George Washington was first elected president. That's how far back we're going. It's also, that Tariff Act is actually also called the Hamilton Tariffs of 1789. So for those wondering, yes, the founding fathers absolutely had Drawback in mind. It's been embedded in America's, economic strategy from the earliest years of the Union. So it's the very first major legislative act passed by the first Congress after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So why was it created? It's to promote U.S. manufacturing, exports, and trade competitiveness. 1789, now it's 2025, right? So 236 years later, it's still doing exactly that. Drawback helps American businesses stay competitive in what's become a truly global company, much more global than what our founding fathers probably thought. Like, it makes domestic manufacturing more affordable it allows us to import cheaper raw materials or components that may not even be available here. It also avoids taxation on goods that don't actually sell in the U.S. commerce. Since they're being exported, it wouldn't be fair, right, to tax something as an import and it doesn't sell here. And all of that leads to better pricing of goods domestically here for us, and also of American-produced goods once they're sold in international markets. Next. So what is Drawback, really? The definition I have on here, it's a much simpler definition than what's on the regs. Drawback is a refund of the import duties, taxes, fees, and tariffs paid when the goods or the products manufactured from them are later exported or destroyed. And with that, you can get up to 99% back with a successful claim. So simpler yet, just think about this. If your company imports and then exports, there's a good chance that you can get money back. So let's say your company pays $10 million in annual import duties. You bring that inventory in and 10% of it gets exported. You would have paid $1 million in duties that were exported, right? And through Drawback, you can get 99% of that back. That's a $990,000 refund check, and it could help any business out there. Next. So these are the primary types of Drawback. We're skipping some of the niche categories today. I know some of you guys are aware of Drawback and know that there's other programs out there. There's niche categories like petroleum, distilled spirits and wine, and something really niche. Imported salt cured meats. It can get very specific, but we'll focus on the most common ones. So unused merchandise. That means same goods that were imported are later exported or destroyed. Manufacturing Drawback. It's in the name. The imported components are used to produce a finished product, then they're later exported or destroyed. And there's rejected merchandise Drawback. So let's just say you received something defective, or you got something that you didn't order from your supplier, you can send it back. and get the duties back, or you can destroy it if it's more cost effective to do it that way. And the fourth one, it's a special provision, and it's becoming a lot more popular, especially in the day and age of e-commerce. Returned retail merchandise drawbacks. So for goods sold to an end customer, that would be like you and me, like we order something from Amazon and we return it. If these businesses can't resell them, they can later export or destroy these products for drawback. But time limits do matter. We have to keep that in mind. So for the first three, you have 5 years from the date of import to export and claim the drawback. And for return retail merchandise, the window is just 1 year. It's a very important distinction. Next.
Before you go ahead, John, let me just ask you a quick question. So we have a question that came in that said, our inventory is commingled with returns and new goods. We do not segregate and we do not systematically track. Previous drawback consultants have advised that this disqualifies us for the program. Is this still true?
If you don't mind, Adam, we actually have a slide on that. So
Perfect.
yeah, if you could, yeah. Well, we promise to take care of that. Actually, Raph will have an answer for that. It's going to be
Great.
a detailed answer. Thanks. So slide 6, please, Raph. So what can you claim back through drawback? And just as important, what can't you, right? So here are the duties. The ones on the left are the duties eligible for drawback. All ordinary customs duties. That would be your, most favored nations rate, the regular duty rate you would have on your HTS classification for your product. Not everyone is aware of this, but Section 301 duties for Chinese goods, they are eligible for drawback. And that's a big chunk of what's being recovered in the last 5 years. There's the MPFs, there's the HMFs. It's not just duties, it's also fees. And there's IR taxes for alcohol and tobacco. And at the bottom, I know it's being contested right now, as Adam was talking about, but on paper, the reciprocal tariffs are eligible for drawback. Again, it's eligible for drawback. There's a lot of misunderstanding out there that it might not be, but it definitely is, okay? And to the right, we have the duties not eligible for drawback. Anti-dumping and countervailing duties are not eligible for drawback. Section 232, unfortunately, I know, given the timing of yesterday's increase, unfortunately, it is not eligible for drawback. We also have the over quota agricultural products that would not be eligible for drawback, and the fentanyl tariffs from February, not eligible for drawback. So
I just wanted just a quick point. So this is something Adam's been talking about internally, but on your slide here, you've got the reciprocal tariffs on all countries between 10 and 125%. Despite the ruling last week and the stay of that ruling, those tariffs must be paid, right, Adam? Situation we're in right now.
Correct. That is not changing. So, to John's point, if this ever gets resolved, it potentially could be a nice chunk of money that importers could get refunded with drawback.
Absolutely. Raph? So why now? Drawback's been around. Why are you doing it? I think we're all in this webinar for the same exact reason: tariffs, right? We know this guy, the guy on the screen, or we might be that guy. Everything's fine, guys. Everything's fine. Everything will be fine, and that's a hope. But everything around us is currently on fire. So, tariffs go up, tariffs disappear, they come back in. 145 one week, 20 the next one. It's chaos. We all know the pain. We're all in this together. But as Adam was talking about, the CIT made a ruling. And unfortunately, a day later, the administration was able to get a stay on that, a pause, which means everyone is still paying these tariffs. So what is my takeaway for this? And this is my personal view on things is, at this time, businesses need to control what they can and save where they can. In a trained environment that we're in right now, where everything changes almost daily, drawback gives you a way to extract real savings from your existing supply chain. So if you're already importing, you're already exporting, you might as well get some money back. That's a takeaway. Look, we don't know when this roller coaster ends and when things settle down, but for now, I think, an old adage applies here, like a penny saved is a penny earned. And some of you might have experienced drawback here and maybe wondering, should I do drawback on the reciprocal tariffs now? It's a hard question to ask. And a hard question to answer, but given the uncertainties, The answer is complicated, and that's the honest answer, as there's still a lot of unknowns. It seems like the only right answer today to all related questions, I think Adam feels this, is I don't know. I don't know yet. Right? We don't know whether the ruling is going to be overturned, it's going to be upheld, and if it's upheld, are the refunds going to be automatic or just GSP refunds, or do we have to do protests on them? But one clear analogy that may help the trade community, I think, is my experience with the dilemma we had with the GSP duties. When GSP expired in 2020, there was a lot of debate within this very small niche drawback community. Should you do drawback on the GSP duties if they were going to be auto refunded anyways? Like all the other times GSP was reinstated, they were auto refunded. But today, 2025, it's 5 years later, there's been, I want to say, hundreds of millions of dollars and continually increasing they're expiring because people are waiting, right? And we still don't know. We still don't know if GSP is going to be reinstated, and if it will, when. So at the very least, I would urge everyone to at least explore setting up a drawback program. So the application process, which Raf will talk about, it takes a few months. So hopefully by then we'll have some clarity on what the long-term tariff landscape is going to be. And if you go through this exercise, at least you'll have a drawback program that will continually benefit your company well past this chaotic period in time. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rafa. I think he's going to go on a deeper dive into why businesses should seriously consider drawback and how it will impact your operations. Raf, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, John. So now that you know the what, or at least at a high level, let's talk quickly about the why. And then we'll dive a little bit more into how this may or may not apply to you. So look, drawback is one of the few legal ways you have to get some relief from tariffs and duties. And importantly, it is something that goes directly to your bottom line, right? Duties come out of your landed cost. Every penny saved there goes directly back to improve your margins. In many cases, particularly for large public companies, drawback claims need to get reported in their earnings releases, right? This is not a small amount of money that can be recovered. This can be meaningful to operations and to your margins, which investors and owners want to know. So if you're wondering whether or not this is going to be, a couple dollars here, a couple dollars there, take a look at the numbers and think through, because these numbers can have significant implications to your P&L and to your finances. And particularly in today's environment where we may or may not be headed towards a baseline rate of tariffs across the board, that's going to now apply to everyone, right? Lots of folks have been in a duty-free environment, certain countries, and now all of a sudden they've got a 10% baseline hit to their P&L. And so if you've got import and you've got export and you're paying duties, drawback is literally found money. And you're here because you want to know more about it. So hopefully, we're starting from that baseline, but it is something that's important. Look, I'm sure if you've ever heard the word drawback before, someone has told you, tread carefully, it can be complicated. And, the short answer is it can be. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. And think about how your personal income taxes works. You file your claim, you get a refund proactively from the government based on the honor system. The government is trusting, and the IRS is trusting that your tax accountant has prepared your returns properly. And so because of that, there is a bar to pass before the government will say, yes, we will give you back drawback refund. And so because of that, there is a bar. You do have to show and demonstrate to customs that you've got the systems and the processes in place to support a drawback program. But once you do that, the ongoing effort can be streamlined. In fact, in today's environment with up and coming technology and changes, this becomes less and less, right? Integrations, AI, all of these things help streamline the process and can really, really make a difference and sort of give you a gift that keeps on giving, which I think is very, very important. The other and sort of really important piece when it comes to drawback is, as John mentioned, you can go back 5 years. right? So let's take the example John gave earlier. If you have an annual duty burden of $10 million a year and 10% of your goods are exported, your first claim can be as high as $5 million, right? It may be $1 million a year going forward, but if you can go back the full 5 years, that's $5 million. And so if you think about what's the, there might be some effort up front to get it going, there's also a bigger payoff for that first claim, right? And so if you need some support internally, data resides in different teams, you need IT to make a change. These are things where if you run the numbers, you'll realize that the initial claim can offset that initial burden quite significantly and often can be even more valuable.
So Raphael, along those lines, you did mention, that you can go back 5 years, and that by going back 5 years, you can claim a significant portion. We've received a lot of questions that basically ask, what is the minimum drawback amount that would be viable for someone to be submitted, and could they submit it on their own?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. And I think what I will say is, I'll say two things. So in 2018, as part of the TIFTIA regulations, Customs removed the option to file drawback claims via paper. Historically, you could fill out a form, mail it into your local office, and get the refunds. And as part of the effort to streamline the burden on Customs and to make things more reliable, they removed that. And so because of that, you now have to file through what's known as ABI, which is sort of, think of it as a back-end API into the ACE portal. And in order to do that, you generally need some sort of software. Now, the challenge with Drawback is that there's a lot of sort of compliance and nuances upstream of that. And so the software options for self-filing are unfortunately quite limited and require a fair amount of expertise. It is possible. There are software vendors out there that will do that. DutyWise is one of them. But generally, most claimants tend to work with a provider or a broker, given the sort of trade-offs and the requirements needed to self-file. In terms of the sort of the minimum, I think that number, so this is a bit of a nuanced question. The answer is it sort of depends, like usual. It depends on the complexity of the program. It depends on the destination, as we'll talk in a minute. But generally, I think most claimants find the threshold to be around $50,000 a year is when it's worth the upfront effort to set it up, and then the ongoing effort to file a drawback. And I will say, I think that number is going to decrease over time as systems mature, as platforms mature, and technology comes into this niche corner of customs and trade compliance. I think that number will come down over time. So sort of, if it's not necessarily applicable now, definitely pay attention to that and ask. And then also remember that with that 5-year look back, that number, can be, that initial claim can really help offset that and get you over that hurdle. Okay, let's dive into a few scenarios that hopefully resonate with the audience and can bring this home a little bit more closely to sort of, your specific scenario. And before we do that, I'm going to quickly give a background on something called direct ID and substitution. These are two terms you've probably heard if you've ever heard of Drawback before. You may have heard correct information or incorrect information. So hopefully we can clarify that. Direct ID at its core is the notion or the idea that you're tracing your goods through your inventory at the SKU level. If you imported 100 units of a SKU ABC, you sold 95 domestically, you sold 5 to customers in Canada, all with the same SKU ABC, you can file drawback on those 5 items with that SKU by offsetting the 100 that you imported. That's direct ID at the SKU level. Substitution. Substitution is at the HTS level. So substitution is sort of a very fun opportunity in Drawback, and it basically allows you to offset imports and exports at the same 8-digit HTS level. And that's because the government, as part of DFTA in 2018, says these are commercially interchangeable. It has to be at the 8-digit. Now, there are some caveats to that and some exclusions, but at its basic level, that's what substitution is. So if you import an item with, HTS 123, and you export a different item, a totally different SKU, but it's got the same HTS, you can claim drawback on those exports, right? So the important distinction here is that for direct ID, it has to be at the same SKU. For substitution, it has to be at the same 8-digit HTS. Now, there are some nuances. In some cases, it's not the same 8-digit HTS. It's got to be the same 10-digit HTS. And then for certain HTSs, it's actually not eligible at all, and you'd have to use direct ID. And then sort of the last most commonly known exception to substitution is the destination country. So unfortunately, substitution is not allowed for Canada and Mexico, and that is due to sort of USMCA rules. But for other countries, and Chile, but for other countries, you can use substitution, which comes with two very nice benefits. One is it is a little bit less burdensome on record keeping and an operational process. And then secondly, because it only has to be at the same HTS level, you have a lot more opportunity for recovering and matching up across your goods. Any questions, Adam?
Sure. So we received a question, because I'm glad you brought up the difference between direct ID and substitution. We had a question where someone asked, can I seek duty refund on an imported HS code product, but I export out of the US, the exact same amount, but it's a US produced product?
So the short answer is yes. The origin of the exports for substitution is not a requirement. What is important is that it's the same. Obviously, again, there's the caveats about the country and the destination and the specific HTSs. But yes, that is a unique aspect of substitution that you can do that.
We've received a lot of questions related to manufacturing related questions, so I'm going to hold those off and let you go a little further, because I know there's some other things that you want to cover same thing with destroyed merchandise. So
okay,
I'll let you move forward, and then we can touch those.
Awesome. So manufacturing, that's another, in fact, it's actually one of the least used provisions in Drawback, largely because historically that's been fairly complicated. Manufacturing is perfectly eligible for Drawback if you've got the records to support that. And generally there is a little bit of a higher burden in terms of the records you need to do manufacturing. You do need, the imports, you need your bill of materials, you need to know your exports, and we have to be able to match that up. But manufacturing is absolutely eligible if you've got inputs or components to your process and you're finished, and then you export your finished product. You are absolutely eligible to claim drawback on the duties and tariffs for your components that went into that. There is something important to know when it comes to Canada and Mexico. Again, thanks to USMCA, if those goods qualify for a USMCA exemption when they get imported into Canada and Mexico, then drawback is probably not going to work. And that's because there is a rule called the lesser of. And the lesser of says that when you're filing drawback with a USMCA export, you have to choose the lesser of the duties that were paid into Canada or Mexico or into the US. And so if it qualifies for a USMCA exemption, the duties going into Canada should be zero, and therefore you're going to end up with $0 drawback. So that is important to know. If you're not qualifying, if your exports don't qualify for USMCA exemption, then you can claim drawback. And again, within manufacturing, you can do either direct ID or substitution. Same concepts exist. It's just sort of one more level in between to match up between your imports and your exports. I'll talk quickly about the last two here. Also less commonly known provisions within drawback, but in some cases, particularly for e-commerce and direct-to-consumer sectors, or importers and exporters, these can actually be a much larger opportunity for you. So, rejected merchandise, if you've got, a container of vitamins that have expired, they couldn't sell, or you've got a batch of wood flooring that came in and was, malformed or whatever, and you want to send that back or you want to destroy it, those are eligible for drawback. And then this last one, I think, is something that's also very, very not well known and sort of speaks to the question, which we'll actually address in the next slide, the commingled returns. But this is one of those benefits that comes along with non-commingled returns, is that you can actually file drawback for that returned merchandise. So if you track it separately, then you can get drawback on those goods. So for example, if you're a footwear or apparel and you get back clothes that you cannot resell, again, with the one year distinction that John mentioned, you can get drawback on that as well. So I'll pause there very quickly.
Raphael, I did want to ask. So when we were discussing this webinar, we were talking about many more of these common scenarios, and no doubt most of the audience here can relate to some of these. But I thought an idea might be to talk about some of the more uncommon scenarios, so that some of the audience might be able to think, wow, if that was possible, then maybe my situation is possible too. And there was one in particular that was out of this world, as they say. I wonder if you can tell us about that one.
Oh, yes.
That is a fun one. So out of this world, that's a good one. So little known fact, but any item that goes into space is considered an export. In fact, when you file your drawback claim, there's a specific call out in the specifications for what value to put if the good is being exported to space, right? So it's got its own country code, so to speak. And it is something that I think, as we look around us and SpaceX and all of these, sort of the revival of space exploration, there's more and more goods being sent up. And a lot of those goods are coming, manufacturing its components. So there's obviously some nuance to it, but yes, sending something into space would qualify as an export. Another fun one is any goods that get loaded onto most cruise ships. Most cruise ships are not domiciled in the US and do qualify as exports for drawback. So yeah, there's a number of, as John mentioned, really unique provisions when it comes to drawback. And yeah, that's a fun one.
Great, Adam. Should we go through some of these questions? Because
Yeah. We've got quite a bit. So let me throw one out at you. We received a question that basically asked, well, we're the importer of record, but we're not the exporter. Can we claim duty drawback? I knew that was the next slide.
All right. You know what? Let me do this slide. You guys are just giving me the home run here. So let me do this slide, and then very end. We have one more slide after this, which is the process and timeline. But let's talk about this real quick. So the hot topics, right? The challenges, and how do we help solve that, or how can you solve that? Look, drawback, as we saw in the first slide, there's many billions of dollars that are being claimed today. So if anyone tells you the drawback is not for you, I guarantee you somewhere in that $4.6 billion is another importer or exporter who's got the exact same situation as you and has figured it out, right? Maybe help. So I want that, I want your takeaway to be that there are some things you may have to change, but all of them have solutions, and many of them are actually accounted for in the regulations. So, good segue as if you're the importer but not the exporter, the regulations actually specifically say, guess what? Yes, the default person who gets, or the default entity for drawback is the exporter. However, you can assign that right to someone else. Now, can you assign it to anyone? No, it does have to be someone who's involved and sort of been involved in the transaction from the time it's imported to the time it's exported. So you can't just assign it to your neighbor. However, you can assign it. There's a template, form they can fill out. It doesn't have to be on every export. It can be for a period of time. Hey, for the next 10 years, I'm going to assign all of my exports to so-and-so, this address, etc. And that's actually very, very, very common scenario. And then the other thing to know about in that scenario, in that situation is you do want to make sure that you've got the records and documents for the export so that when you get audited, you don't have to rely on that person or that entity to have those records. It would be very important to ensure that a process you keep in mind is as you sell to international customers or as items get exported, you bring those documents in-house. I'll jump back to the first one, which is probably the number one reason folks get sort of wary and drawback programs don't get off the ground. And a lot of that is related to either thinking they don't have the right documents or just not having them. Some of those documents reside with counterparties in the supply chain. Some of them are at your broker. Some of them are with customers. But it is not, if you sit down and think through it and you know which documents you actually need, it is very possible to update different retention agreements, formalize what you have and don't have, and then bring those in-house to ensure that you do have the documents and records that you need. Not the importer is another very common one. It's a little bit more complicated because some of that data is sensitive, but a very common solution to that is double blind agreement, get a drawback broker who can sit in the middle and make sure that that sensitive information is not shared with your customers, or the importer wants to ensure it's not shared with their customers. And then the last two. So direct ID, historically, right, we talked earlier, you're exporting to Canada or Mexico, you cannot take advantage of substitution. You must use J1 or direct ID. And historically, the challenge has been that a lot of importers don't clear their imports into the US at the SKU level. And so what that means is that if you need to track things at the SKU level, it becomes operationally quite a burden to get these claims prepared and to know which line and which entry on, which entry and which line on the entry on your imports the SKU was imported on, which is a very important requirement when you're preparing a drawback claim. And so historically, I think direct ID to Canada, Mexico has been a very not a well-used or common provision. I think the good news is that, technology has dramatically improved, the options here. And there's really two paths to solve this. One is work with your broker, your import broker, and clear your goods at the SKU level. That has a number of benefits for drawback, both direct ID as well as substitution. And you can maximize your claim in ways that you wouldn't otherwise be able to. And then for historical data, even if you're not cleared at the SKU level, look, at DutyWise, we've built custom technology using the latest and greatest to make that process easier for historical data, right? So technology has come a long way in enabling that. And given that Canada and Mexico are two of our largest trade partners, there's a lot of money left on the table right now when it comes to direct ID. Lastly, the topic that everyone's favorite topic in drawback, commingled returns. So to the original question, unfortunately, the advice you got was correct. If you have returns, if you have goods that are sold and then returned, and they're like new, still in the box, they come back to the warehouse, someone inspects them and says, these can be sold as new, and they go back into your general inventory. Unfortunately, that will disqualify the entire inventory for that specific SKU. And the reason for that is, as one of the earlier slides mentioned, unused is the technical term used for drawback. The intent of drawback is that a good comes into the US, it is not used, and it is re-exported or destroyed. When it comes to return goods, unfortunately, Customs has ruled that that is considered used. If it's sold, it's considered used for its intended purpose, and it's no longer eligible for drawback. If your returns are commingled, you can no longer tell Customs, the item I'm claiming drawback on was not used, right? And so because of that, it is very important to, if you want to do drawback, particularly in the e-commerce world where this is, very common, think through with your, 3PL, with your operations team, how can we segregate these items and have a separate process so that even if they are like new, we can at least know they were returned and not used. I will add one more thing, which is there's a lot of information here. This is one of those. So commingled returns is one of the few things that is virtually impossible to fix retroactively. So we talked about being able to go back 5 years. Commingled returns, unfortunately, would disqualify that. However, it is possible to segregate that. Lots of companies do. If you've got separate inventory, that works. And, it is worth going and having that conversation today so that even if you don't intend to file a drawback today, but you want to do it in 6 months, you can at least get those 6 months of drawback.
And I just want to point out, Ralph, like if you have a SKU within your inventory that's never been returned, you don't have to claim drawback on the entirety of your historical imports and exports. The rules do allow you to just claim a piece of it. So if you are confident on a piece of something like SKU DEF has never been returned, but they've been exported, you can claim drawback on that SKU, but not ABC because an instance of it has been returned. So you can, in a way, pick and choose without polluting the whole inventory.
All right, Adam,
so
now.
I got two. Yes, I've got two questions for you. So, one person said, "Look, I understand you can claim drawback for destroyed product," and we've got a couple of questions about how that works. But what about donated products? Are they eligible for drawback?
It depends where you donate them. So if you donate domestically, you can't. You do get a tax write-off, right? But other companies, what they have done is donated internationally. So you donate and get a tax write-off on that, and you also get to export. So it's double the benefit, and truly, it's for a good cause, right? So that's a way to do that.
So you are able to essentially double dip if you were donating.
I didn't want to say that
internationally, but that's what it is essentially.
For a good cause, Adam.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
I suppose you incur the exporting costs, of course, but still, it's a possibility. Let me jump in with a question. So I did have one about commingling, but I think you answered that. But the next one I have, what are the documents needed for the drawback program? And what are the typical challenges companies face in getting the refund, e.g. preparations of documents, getting support from distributors, etc.?
I'll take quickly the documents one, and then John, if you want to talk maybe through some of the common reasons why, reasons why drawback claims are challenges there. I think the short answer is when it comes to direct ID. So there's actually two different, I would call them categories of documents. There's a set of documents that you need to have access to in the case of a review or an audit, and that you'll need to apply for your application. And then there's a set of documents or data that you need to actually file the claim. I think it's important to think of those as separate, right? Because you don't want to get overwhelmed with what you have to share with your broker to prepare the claim on every single claim. But it is very important that you have access to a more detailed set of documents. And that detailed set of documents is the trace of your goods from the time it's imported to the time it's exported. So think of it as your import entry packet, your entry into inventory, your receipt into inventory, the withdrawal from inventory, and your export documents at a very basic level. Those are the things you're going to want to ensure you have access to, and it's got the right elements sort of showing the journey of that item through. Now, one very, very, very common question we get is, do I have to know where this item was physically? If I export a particular pen, does that physical pen need to be sort of trackable with a serial number? And the answer is no. Right? When it comes to direct ID, you can use the most granular element that can describe that item, which is generally going to be a SKU. If you've got a serial number, great. If you don't, you can use your SKU. When it comes to footwear and apparel, you're going to want the style, the color, and the size, since that's what uniquely identifies it. But you don't need to know that this pen, this physical pen, blue pen with whatever on it was imported on this particular date. You just need to know when all of your blue pens were imported.
Yeah, what makes that possible is actually Customs allows you to use an accounting methodology. So any SKU can be matched to any product of the same SKU. So you're not tracking the actual unit, it's units of the same SKU.
So let me ask you another question. If you know, we're talking about the process here. If I return defective material prior to submitting my request for duty drawback, can I still request the drawback on those duties paid?
Absolutely. But you do have to apply for a drawback program. Raph will touch on this. I'll go over quickly. You need an application for privileges, and one of the privileges is a one-time waiver. The normal process is you notify customs, I'm going to export something and I'm going to claim drawback on it. And they will either examine or just let you export it, right? So if you didn't do that, if you didn't submit that notification, normally you can't do drawback. But there is an out, and it's called a one-time waiver. And as the name suggests, you can do it one time. And what we do, along with the other privileges that Rafa will talk about down the line, is we apply for that for the whole program. So you can claim back anything within the last 5 years that you didn't notify customs you were exporting, and you can claim drawback on it. So you can fix that situation.
So let me just take that one step further. So I'm a company. I filed drawback 10 years ago, right? And I did it for a couple of years, and I haven't filed drawback in the last, I don't know, 6, 7 years. Can I go back 5 years a second time? Because the first time when I did it, when I filed originally, I filed for a one-time waiver going back 5 years.
There's a bit of nuance there, but the first thing we're going to do as a drawback broker is look at your ACE profile. We're going to see if your privileges were transferred or grandfathered at the time of TITIA. And in, I want to say 99% of the time they have been. So while this has happened and you didn't do drawback, you would have applied, I presume, your broker would have applied for a waiver or prior notice. That means you're allowed to export at will without notifying customs in the future. So what would have been in the future in 2008 is actually now your past. So that's covered by that privilege. Therefore, you can claim drawback on it.
Okay.
I think this is another great segue into the next and last slide. So let's talk about that real quick. We'll talk about process and timelines, and then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. So drawback. There's 2 different ways you can file drawback. As John mentioned, the default is if you want to export or destroy something, you must tell customs before you do that. You wait for them to come either review and verify it or waive that right. And then once that happens, which is a 5 business day window, you can then export with sort of the sign off. At that point, you can claim drawback. Now you can imagine, and then once you claim drawback in that scenario, you're going to wait about 1 to 3 years to get your refund, right? That's because the claim has to liquidate. You can imagine if you have an ongoing program of exports or destruction, you're not going to want to tell customs before every single little, parcel shipment leaves and goes to a customer somewhere. And so there is the option to do what's called the privilege application. And what that does is you're applying to customs with a bunch of documents and records and saying, hey, I've got really good systems and processes to support drawback. You should trust me. Give me, honor system. I've got everything I need in place to be able to pass an audit. Why don't you trust me? That way I don't have to tell you before every import and export. And when you do that and customs reviews and approves that, you then get 3 different privileges, right? As customs will tell you, it is a privilege, not a right. So they do have to review and approve it. But you generally will apply for 3 privileges. The first, as John mentioned, is the one-time waiver. That gives you a 5-year look back where you didn't tell customs ahead of time, no problem. You can claim drawback on those 5 years of exports or destroyed goods, so long as you've got the documents and certification. The second privilege is what's called the waiver of prior notice. And that's where you get the ability to export in the future or destroy in the future without needing to let customs know before each export. And then the last one, which is the one that people like the most, is accelerated payment. And that allows you to get your refund proactively within 3 to 4 weeks of filing the claim prior to the claim being liquidated. And so what that means is you'll post a bond for the amount of the claim, you'll get your refund 3 to 4 weeks later, and then at some point in the next 1 to 4 years, your claim may get reviewed. You have to obviously pass the desk review and the audit. If you don't, have the records to support your claim, then customs will deny the claim and you'll have to pay back what you got, right? So it's important to make sure that when you file the claim, you have the records and documents and you know that you're going to get to keep your money. And then once the claim is liquidated, you're sort of off the hook on that one. So I think that's important. And then, importantly, there is a timeline for customs to review and approve the application. And that's generally anywhere from 12 to 16 weeks. So think of that as like 3 to 4 months from the time you submit the application to when it's approved. In that time, your broker should be preparing the claim, getting it ready. And then once it's approved, you file the claim, you get your money back 3 to 4 weeks later. At that point, once you've got those 3 privileges, future claims, you'll get your refund in 3 to 4 weeks. So hopefully that addresses some of those questions about historical and non-historical. And I think the last question, if you've applied for one-time waiver in the past, hopefully you also applied for the waiver of prior notice. And so from that point on, you wouldn't need that.
Excellent. I'll say that we have quite a number of questions left. We've only got about 4 or 5 minutes left. But if people still have questions in the webinar, please do still submit them. We'll pass them to Raphael and John, and they can answer afterwards. And then we'll send the answers back when we distribute the link for this webinar. I don't want people to be shortchanged on the answers. So got quite a long question here, but we are the import of record, mainly on import defense spare parts. We have US government contract in place where a few of the items under contract are imported and then exported to different countries. Now, the complicated part. We are not the exporter on record. We ship the items through several freight forwarders of foreign governments, and they take care of exporting the items. All of the spare parts are shipped as is. We have never claimed or processed duty drawback, and we don't really have the experience. Is there an opportunity there for us?
Short answer is yes, and that ties back to what Raphael was talking about with the exporter of record. But I suggest that we have a conversation offline. It's going to be a very detailed approach when dealing with something as complex as that. But I promise to get back to you with an answer for that question.
I suppose the long and the short answer is don't disqualify yourself. Allow us to disqualify you. No, I mean, send us your situations and your scenarios and let the team here help you with that decision. So if you think there's an inkling that there might be a chance, ask us and we can find out. Sorry, Adam, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I think, and Raphael, you mentioned also how you could get your duties back more quickly. So that we did receive a question that asked, would the same bond cover the one-time application and the annual application, or do you need 2 separate bonds for drawback?
So there's a different bond for drawback specifically, which is different from your import entry bond, right? And that's because the nature of the risk and the details of the drawback is different. You can use one-time, single-use bonds, one-time use bonds, or continuous bonds as well for drawback. So if you do think you're going to have an ongoing program, you can get a continuous bond for that. We do offer that and help facilitate that as well. Yeah, it is a little different, but if you want accelerated payment, you do need to post a bond for that.
Just a little trade secret here. When you do apply for those privileges, Customs doesn't actually need you to have a bond. They just want to make sure that you are going to get a bond at the time that you're submitting a claim. So you can tell them, I don't know what these values are yet. We're going to determine it, but we will secure a single transaction bond once we have a claim. And that's a sufficient answer, right? But if you do know absolutely what the numbers are, if you're one of those companies that are very sophisticated and you know exactly what you're going to claim for the next calendar year, then absolutely get a continuous bond for the right amount. And that will be accepted as well.
All right. I think I have a question, which is probably a one-word answer. If you return defective material prior to submitting your request for duty drawback, can you still request drawback of paid duties?
One-time waiver.
There you go. Good stuff.
All right,
Excellent.
I got one more question before we end. I think this will be also, hopefully it's an easy, short answer. Product that was brought in for whatever the reason, it has to be destroyed, but the duty has already been paid. Does that qualify for drawback?
Raph, you want to go?
Yes. Yes, and again, it's that window of time you have from when it was imported to when you file the drawback claim, right? So the clock stops on that 5-year window when you file the claim. When it comes to destruction, it's important to remember you do need the right paperwork to show that it was destroyed. So it's not just, go to your mom and have her, go to the doctor and have them sign a doctor's note that says, oh yes, I wasn't feeling well that day. I've got, 2 young kids, so I know how this goes. But you do need to have the right paperwork. But if you do, you absolutely can file, you can get drawback on duties that were already paid. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we definitely at the top of the hour now, so we'll get to the rest of the questions. Thank you for sending those in. Huge thank you to Raphael, John, and Adam for your time. Very, very insightful, very, very informative. Thank you. We've recorded this webinar and we'll send out a link as soon as we've made the edit, along with a copy of the presentation as well. So look out for that. We'll continue to keep you updated and informed on regulatory updates. Obviously, there's a lot happening, like Adam alluded to at the start of this webinar. So we'll keep sending those out to you. Look out for those in your inboxes. And once we have the next topic, we'll communicate the next webinar out. But also I wanted to say, if you have a topic that's top of mind for you and you wanted to recommend that we do a webinar on that, then send your idea to solutions@albawheelsup.com, solutions@albawheelsup.com, and then we can bring in the experts and we can certainly talk about that. So once again, thank you to our panel here and thank you to the audience. Really appreciate your time. We hope you found this webinar informative, and until we see you next time, goodbye.